I got a wet sponge and applied some emerald green to it.
When working with a sponge and applying your base layers, you want the sponge to be almost wet. If the sponge is too wet, it will start essentially doing this weird staining effect. But again, it's not an issue because it's a base color. You'll be going over it again to cover all that up, and it'll give you a much smoother transition between all your other colors. I would definitely recommend the fact that you always want to keep your sponge damp. Never allow it to get dry when you're applying a lot of base colors, as it'll create this very odd looking texture that the sponge essentially has. Here I mainly wanted to demonstrate the fact that it doesn't matter if you mess up your base paint, as long as you're working very thin and your paint is diluted, you'll have an easier time fixing those little mistakes. However, in this specific case, I actually wanted the paint to be this inconsistent, as it would create more visual interest in the shadows. Here I took uniform green and added it to the mixture of the previous emerald green. I'm using the exact same sponge as previously, and applying it over all the areas where the highlights will finally be. I'm only applying a single layer, as later on I'll be going back with uniform green and going over all these areas once again. I'm not applying a lot of pressure as to leave the previous colors still visible in parts of the areas. I'm ignoring the backpack as that'll be painted black in the later step. Here I took a new sponge and grabbed some uniform green on its own. The sponge is much less wet so that the color will be coming out much thicker, but still thin enough that we're not leaving behind any of the texture. I'm treating each part of the model as its own little cylinder and applying it to the highest peak of the cylinder, and leaving the furthest parts as a shadow, as I'm imagining the light hitting the cylinder and then slowly getting diffused as it goes further down. I went blind into this model, so I didn't exactly know where I was going to place my colors or the highlights, so I took my time looking over the model and thinking about it. Next, I moved on to AK Brownish Green, grabbing a much smaller sponge so I'll have an easier time hitting those edges. I'm still using a relatively wet sponge when applying this color, as I want the layer to be very thin. Since the color is very different from all the previous ones, by working much thinner, I'm able to create a much smoother transition between. To compensate for that, I'm applying very little pressure, so the paint doesn't spill into areas where I don't want it to be, since any extra strength will accidentally create a very splotchy effect that we don't want to have. For example, here in the helmet, I used slightly too much pressure, so it resulted in that extra big blob. But since it's the back of the model, it's not too much of an issue, and I'm just ignoring it and leaving it as is. This was also the moment I remembered I forgot to paint the hand holding the gun, so I made sure I painted that as well. Here I took a single dot of Vallejo Ice Yellow and mixed in some brownish green with some uniform green to hopefully create a much more even highlight. If I was to use brownish green on its own with ice yellow, the color would come out far too yellow and just look unnatural to the green of the model. By using uniform green, we're creating a much more even color that you'd expect from the highlight, given the fact that the model is supposed to be green, not yellow. This is also the first layer of the highlight, so by using a much darker saturated color, we'll have a much more even transition. Once we apply the final highlight, we'll just create the bright peak points of where the light is supposedly hitting the armor. A good thing to consider when applying an edge highlight is don't try to use the tip of your brush, use the edge. Even though in some of these parts it doesn't really look like it, it's still the edge of the brush that's actually hitting the model and not the tip. By using the side of the brush, we're allowing the model to essentially be a guide for our brush and have an easier time to create a much smoother, thinner, even line. If you were to use the tip, you'd find you have a much harder time actually having the line straight, and it would deviate a lot from area to area, creating very uneven edges. For the first pass of the highlight, I did my best to not cut the video up and leave as much of it as I could to make sure that you have an easier time understanding where I'm applying the highlights and just how slowly I'm doing it. When applying a highlight to the flat area as this piece of the leg, I'm essentially creating a lot of horizontal lines that are leading vertically up. Ironically, this creates a much more natural view for your eye, and you are less drawn to look at it as an uneven line. Here I took some unmixed ice yellow that we previously had on the palette and mixed it further into the highlight we were using before. All I'm doing now is going over the exact same areas, but I'm not covering the entire area where the previous edge highlight was. I'm trying to focus on the highest peaks and the sharpest corners.
Once again, using the exact same idea of a cylinder and trying to target the peak of the cylinder where the highlight is. I left as much of this footage in as I could to hopefully give you an easier idea to how I'm rotating the model, where I'm placing the lines, and how much of the area I'm actually ignoring versus how much I'm actually painting. I personally used to really hate edge highlighting and found it to be a tedious step until I started practicing using the side of the brush. Once you get used to using the side of the brush instead of instinctually trying to use the tip of the brush, you have an easier time applying them, and this step will be just an actual breeze to you. I personally have very shaky hands and have a difficult time painting perfect straight lines. Since our model's three-dimensional and the designers of the model perfectly understand the fact that they have to have these very sharp edges that are easy to paint, we can use what they've given us and follow it. Now that edge highlighting was done, I moved on to the black. The step is relatively straightforward as we're just covering all areas we can in black. Make sure your paint is nice and wet and then place the brush on the shoulder, dragging it along the surface. By dragging the brush, you should have an easier time not accidentally getting it onto the green when you're trying to place the brush down into those very hard to get edges, resulting in you trying to fix less mistakes and having an easier time when painting a lot of models. I covered the backpack, the head, the weapon, and all the leather parts in black, as well as the canister for the fuel. I also painted the scales black, but that's just unnecessary. However, when painting a big unit, I'd avoid painting unnecessary parts black unless you prefer it when painting. When painting the joints with black, make sure your paint is very wet so that it flows naturally into the joint without you having to apply a lot of pressure. This should make it easier for you. We're actually using magenta and mixing in a lot of black into it to apply our base color, slowly building up to the magenta that we will eventually want the scales to be. After we apply the Streaking Grime, which is going to have a very red tinted hue, it'll even change the magenta to look a lot more red and saturated. I'm applying an extra layer that I technically don't need as I painted the scales black, but if you didn't have this layer and instead there was green from the base you had, you would need to apply this current layer by using a lot of black into the magenta to make sure you have a good coverage over the green and not have it seep through. Next, I took some of the pure magenta and mixed it with the black magenta I had in my brush. This should create a much smoother transition between the very dark and the much more brighter magenta we want to build it up to. I'm calling it magenta, but it's technically wine red from AK Interactive. For the highlight, I took what I had on my brush and mixed in some cadmium red into it, which is a very orange looking color, and just continue applying it over the scales. Looking back on it, I definitely probably could have skipped a few steps and just used black into a little bit of wine red, then used wine red and mixed in just a tiny little of cadmium red. Next, I took some rubber black from AK Interactive and began highlighting all the areas I'd previously painted black. It's technically a very dark yellow color, but it looks very good when placed on top of black and has a very natural looking highlight for it. Given salamanders are supposed to have this very coal-like appearance, I also be using the exact same rubber black to apply it over their skin highlight. Here I took some ice yellow and mixed it into the rubber black to apply over their face, but I'll later on be fixing this mistake as I realized I went far too much into the yellow and resulted into this very odd looking pale color that just didn't look natural to the model. Here I took some rubber black and just glazed over the face to fix the previous mistake. Here I took some wine red and painted their eyes with it, as you wouldn't be able to tell between wine red and red as the eyes are very small. Next, I mixed up some bronze for the weapon by using Bunt Tin from AK Interactive and some Gunmetal from Vallejo Metal Color. The main reason I'm using Vallejo Metal Color here is to actually make the paint consistently much smoother and much shinier and brighter, as using the Bunt Tin on its own is not smooth enough and it's too dark for what I actually want this weapon to look like. I used the exact same color to paint all the other little details, and then I mixed in some chrome to apply a highlight to the weapon. I then grabbed a bit more chrome and just thinly put it over the weapon. As chrome is a very diluted color, it's essentially a thin glaze over the metallic. Here I mixed up some gold by using Vallejo Metal Color Gold and some Green Stuff World pigments. If you want to see how to mix it, I have a short called How to Paint Better Gold that should show how to do it. I also decided to give this guy promotion and painted a shoulder pad gold. Next, I took some deep red from AK Interactive and began painting the torch. I applied it over the entire torch and made sure I had good coverage of it first. Then I took the same cadmium red we used before and began applying essentially a transition to the yellow I was going to have later on. Next, I took white from AK Interactive and placed it over the areas where I wanted the yellow to be. Since yellow is a very difficult color, by using white first, we're able to then place yellow in one smooth layer rather than having to use 5 or 7. It's my preferred method, but you could try doing it other ways. Next, I took some pure black and began painting the actual metal part of the torch. Definitely take your time with this step, as fixing a mistake from black into yellow will be insanely difficult. So take your time, go as slow as you need to, and just really make sure you don't get into any of the actual fire. Our model's nearly complete. For the next step, I'll be using a Streaking Grime from AK Interactive. This is Streaking Grime for Panzer Gray, which has a very red hue, which will work perfectly against the green, as it's a natural contrasting color, and it'll create a very good shadow color that will help the green pop even further. I applied it over the entire model, then used Odourless Thinner to clean it up. I'm using a Q-tip, which is not the ideal thing you want to use, as it'll leave small fibers on the model, but they're not noticeable with the naked eye. But for example, when taking a picture, you can definitely tell they're there. But I personally don't mind, so I'm using the Q-tips. For the next step, I'm using a sponge to essentially filter out the grime and create a smoother transition for where it's at and where I actually want the highlights to be. Then I grab a Q-tip and clean the rest of the grime. This will essentially make sure that all the highlights I previously applied are back in their true color. I made sure to go over all the details where I placed my highlights to make sure my work didn't go to. Once the model was clean and dry, I made sure to varnish it to seal the Streaking Grime, made sure it didn't have an odd smell. I also applied a small black line to the shoulder pad as some of the gold went through. I took the exact same highlight color I used previously and just went over some of the areas where I thought the grime didn't clean off properly enough. This should hopefully make the highlights pop once again in the exact same way I had intended originally. Next, I based the model by using AK Dark Earth, placing it over the entire base. This is where I decided my weapon was a little bit too boring, so I gave it the burnt effect. It's a very simple recipe by using Pro Acryl Transparent Purple, mixing it with some water, and glazing it over your weapon. Then grabbing some Citadel Contrast Talassar Blue, mixing it with some water, and then some transparent purple, and applying it over the edge. Then using some Talassar Blue on its own, just for the tip. Then I grabbed some Burt Umber pigment and applying it over the base and the legs to essentially create a visual connection between the base and the model. Then I just applied a single top onto the base, cleaned up the rim, and we were done. We have an awesome looking nice guy of the 40k universe. And for all the Salamander players out there, Vulcan lives.